Paul from Trending Who, What, Where, and When. Today I will be speaking with the author, Soo Kim, about her book, How to Live Korean. Soo will be joining us from London in the UK.
Hey everyone, this is Soo Kim coming to you from Victoria Park here in East London, just by the Regent's Canal, near where I live. You can see just behind me the famous Chinese pagoda, which is an iconic spot here at the park. I'm looking forward to chatting to you more about my new book, How to Live Korean, which takes a deep dive into all things Korean, from people to culture and everything in between. I'll see you soon.
So I'll start out by asking you to tell our followers where you would take your friends and family when they came to London to visit you.
If I were to have people come over now, probably in terms of somewhere quite near me would be Victoria Park. I mean, I live in East London, which is not too far from just off the Regent's Canal. And so it's a really beautiful park. Victoria Park is one of the largest green spaces in East London. And it's got this beautiful kind of Chinese pagoda, which was featured at the Great Exhibition in 1851 in London. And it kind of is sort of a vestige from then. And it's kind of, yeah, it's really beautiful in terms of green spaces. So I would probably take them there. Okay. And also like in terms of, I mean, there's just so much culture in London, isn't it? But like probably if you wanted to go somewhere slightly offbeat, like off the beaten track, I would say probably this place called the Painted Hall in Greenwich, which is a neighborhood in South London. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I mean, I sort of just stumbled upon it like almost 10 years ago. And right now it's become a bit more developed where it's become kind of a proper exhibition hall. But like when I discovered it, it was just, I just walked into it because I used to live nearby, and and it's at the grounds of the old Royal Naval College here. And it's just incredible Baroque interiors, and it's kind of considered Britain's Sistine Chapel.
You also mentioned the Victoria and Albert Museum in your notes as being your favorite museum.
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. The Victoria Album is kind of, it's one of, I think it's the world's largest museum for like applied art and design, and the interiors are so beautiful. I mean, I love going to it because there's this beautiful courtyard as well, and like whenever you kind of walk through, you see lots of like artists as well doing sketches, kind of just sitting at different corners of the museum. And one of my favorite aspects of that museum is this program that they do once a month called Friday Lates, and it's where they open up the doors of the museum in the evening, and so it kind of carries on into the evening, and it almost becomes like almost a party, but like because they've got music and DJs and stuff, but they hold proper like an actual themed exhibition throughout the night. So, and it's also really interesting to see all their permanent collections like in the evening light. It's very interesting. So I would highly recommend that. It's on the last Friday of every month.
You also mentioned the nightlife in London.
Yes, absolutely. For me, it's always been, I really love hotel bars, and I would recommend, I mean, there's something about hotel bars, I think that feels very exciting, and that, you know, the clientele might be international because they might just be dropping by. They might be local guests or guests of the hotel. And I think that's what I find really interesting. And for me, probably one of my favorite places is called the Ned, which is the name of the hotel. Mm-hmm. And the Ned has like 7 or 8 different restaurants and bars, and it's a hotel and private members club, but anyone can access the restaurants and everything. And I think when you walk into, it's set in this old bank, so it's actually like the vestiges of the bank like are kind of remaining in the interior. And so they have an actual club called, it's for members, but it's called the Vault, and it's actually where they used to keep the money. So yeah, it's really interesting, and it's such a buzzy live vibe in terms of there's live music all the time, but like in the evenings it gets a bit more you know, it's really, really lively because the music is a bit more like lively. But then during the daytime, you might just see like quiet pianists playing, or because they've got this beautiful circular elevated stage sort of as centerpiece when you walk in. When it first opened, which was probably around, I think it opened around 2017, and it was honestly, it was the biggest like London hotel opening, in terms of everybody who was anybody wanted to be at the opening party.
You also mentioned the Aqua Shard.
Yes, the Aqua Shard. If you, in terms of like views, I mean, the Net is obviously just a lively place to go, but in terms of views, I would say, you know, you probably can't beat the Shard, because the Shard is the tallest building in Britain. And I believe it's the tallest actually in Western Europe as well. So, you know, they've got an observation deck, but also they've got a restaurant called the restaurant bar called the Aqua Shard, and which is, you know, floor to ceiling glass windows. And in terms of views, that it's amazing. So definitely I would recommend there.
You have so many good places to go. I loved reading How to Live Korean. I came to your book knowing very little about Korea. After reading your book, I'm very interested in visiting Korea on our next Asia trip. What inspired you to be a writer and write How to Live Korean?
Well, I think like for me, what inspired me in terms of writing, I mean, because, you know, by profession, I'm a journalist, and I would say my sort of first inspiration goes probably all the way back to my undergraduate years back in the States. I distinctly remember my Spanish professor. It's bizarre because I studied psychology, as well as I have a degree in psychology as well as degree in Spanish. And I've always had a love for like languages. So perhaps I've always had this connection with words. And it was my Spanish professor who actually was the first person to ever mention to me that she directly and specifically said to me that I think you would do well in the writing profession. And it never had really crossed my mind, I think, until she had mentioned it. And I think, you know, I realized how important it is, like, to have mentors, because you would never really think about it. And I thought it was even more remarkable because she had made that sort of presumption just based on my writing in Spanish, because I'd been studying like Spanish literature and discussing books in Spanish with her in my different classes, and she had said just based on my Spanish writing that she thought I would be good in the writing profession. And I think that sort of was sort of a launch point for me. And then I kind of tried to do different things that relates to writing as I left undergrad, and then I actually ended up coming over to London to do a master's in international journalism. And so that sort of ignited sort of proper venture, I think, into writing. And you know, in most career I spent it at as a travel journalist at the Telegraph, which is a newspaper here. And obviously through that I wrote a lot about, I mean, here and there I covered Korea as well. And I think through that, like, I was approached about writing this book because my publisher was looking for someone who had a background in Korea, and I became, it was kind of like the best of all worlds sort of came together, because I was in a period where I had a bit of time to be able to write a book, and it just felt like the right time to be writing the book, because, you know, there was just so much interest in Korea, and my publisher had been doing lots of books about like sort of different similar guides but different for different countries and stuff. And I think for them it felt like the next step was Korea, because there was just so much interest in terms of, you know, the explosion of K-pop, and obviously the food, which I think was always like quite, there's certainly an explosion of food interest in Korean food in London specifically. And I think it just, and then obviously when the book was published in November last year, it just felt again like the best time for it to come out because of all the Oscar buzz that the Korean film Parasite had, and it just felt like the right time to do it. And so yeah, I was really inspired to write it.
Tell us about your book, How to Live Korean.
Well, I think in a nutshell, it offers, I try to provide an overview, I think, into all different aspects of Korean life. Everything from like history and traditions, like sort of, I try to touch on a little bit of the nuances, I think, of the culture that maybe only someone who from the inside might be able to sort of better explain. And I think, you know, there's been an interest in that, in the sense of like lots of people are interested in K-pop, like they've I think there's been sort of an appetite for wanting to understand the K-pop artists themselves. And I try to do that, I think, with this book. I really wanted to give an overview, sort of trace sort of the overview of every aspect of Korean life, from how to eat to like where Koreans like to go, what they think, and how they see themselves. So I'm hoping that it will be like a good insider's guide to the culture.
I think so. I think your book was filled with interesting information and really beautiful images. You must have worked hard with finding just those perfect images for the book.
Yeah, I mean, I was very lucky. My publisher did actually involve me a lot in choosing the pictures, because they wanted to make sure that it really reflects what actual Korean life is. And I think, yeah, it was just kind of a teamwork, I think, with my design team, and kind of going back and forth. And I really wanted to sort of show like modern day Korea as well, in terms of like what it's like if you were to go now. So yeah, that's kind of what we were hoping to aim for.
What do you think is the most important part of the introduction that you wrote?
I guess I wanted to say that this book aims to kind of really, go beyond just being a travel guide. I mean, I do recommend places to go, obviously, in terms of in a broad sense, but I think I hope the takeaway will be that, that it's really relevant right now, in terms of this interest in Korean culture, and then B, that this encompasses more than just a how, like, where to go kind of travel guide.
The second chapter, the brief history, you spoke of many different things, like the beginnings of the Korean identity.
After the whole earliest stages, after the just before the final dynasty, the Joseon dynasty, was when it started. The country kind of went through a period of being known as the Hermit Kingdom, and I think that came about as a result of being, having lots of invasions from Japan and China and different countries. And I think the country sort of wanted to, it just kind of cut off or limited like all kinds of trade and things like that. And I think, but it was during that period, just after the Hermit Kingdom kind of period, was the Joseon dynasty, which was the final dynasty era. And I think that era sort of ushered the country into the modern era. And I think it was during that period where sort of the foundations of the country, in terms of like, especially, I mean, even on the most basic level, the country's language was formed in the Joseon dynasty, which was developed by King Sejong. And I think at that time he wanted to have a language that sort of the commoners could speak, because before that, the Koreans were using a language like based on the Chinese languages, and I think, which still exists now, but like, that was kind of like an elitist thing, like people who were of sort of the upper classes knew, and like the others wouldn't really be able to speak it. So I think he wanted to launch a language that everyone could speak, and the only way to do it was to just create a language. So and I think that's kind of symbolic, I think, of how Korea was now genuinely like becoming its own country. So
you spoke also about the Japanese occupation.
So during that period, after the Joseon dynasty, around from 1910, is when the Japanese occupation began, because Japan, China, and like Russia were sort of battling it out over trying to occupy the Korean Peninsula, and Japan won that over, and it was quite a difficult period, I think, in Korean history, in the terms of like, the occupation period was quite heavy-handed in terms of, the oppression that, they wanted to really kind of, Korean culture was really oppressed in terms of people weren't allowed to speak Korean, people were kind of made to abandon their religions, like you had a lot of the people had to worship sort of Japanese Shinto shrines, and sort of abandon I think a lot of Western missionaries had come to Korea, so that Christianity was kind of starting to spread as well. And all of that, like churches were, kind of destroyed, and like things like that happened. And I think, that era kind of, I think, definitely left a big sort of impression and, you know, almost like scars, I think, from that period. People who grew up in that generation, for sure. And even my grandparents, like my grandma, she was fluent. I mean, my grandparents have all passed away, but my grandma, she was fluent in Japanese, and she grew up in that area and in that era. So, you know, it's just interesting how how that generation was affected by it.
You mentioned your grandfather in that chapter.
With my granddad was he's my paternal granddad, and you know, the memories of him were quite foggy, even for my own father, because my father, his dad passed away when he was only like 12 or 13. And I think lots of what had gone on in his career, like, didn't come to light until I did this sort of big trip to South Korea a few years ago for a cover story I was doing for the Telegraph. And it was there that I kind of learned a little bit more about him. And in a nutshell, my granddad, he is a veteran of the country, in the sense of he was very influential in the independence movement against during the Japanese occupation era. My granddad, he studied abroad in America in the early 1900s. He was born in like sort of the 1920s, and he went on to study in Tennessee, of all places, at Maryville College, and it was there that he just by chance was able to meet with one of the founding fathers of the Korean independence movement, An Chang-ho, and who started sort of the biggest clandestine movement during the Korean independence movement. And so he met him there, and then he was also mentored by Syngman Rhee, who became the first president of South Korea, and it was a real you know, he was mentored by these two, you know, historic people who would later become historical figures. And my granddad, you know, during that era, he was doing trips between China and America by ship. And the reason why there was trips happening in China was because in Shanghai at the time there was this sort of partially recognized government that was existing and was based in Shanghai. So there was a lot of like covert kind of missions going on in terms of going back and forth as part of the independence movement. And I think my granddad he would always carry the Korean flag in his like briefcase, and he was outed on one of his journeys. Unfortunately, someone had spotted him. I don't know how he got spotted. He must have maybe just looked at it or something, but like someone spotted it, reported it to the Japanese authorities, obviously because he would be accused of treason, and you know it was illegal to have any kind of Korean sense of pride at the time. So he was taken to Shanghai, where he was arrested, and then he was taken to Japan, where he was put into prison, and he was just like tortured throughout his stay there, and he wasn't released until 1945, which is when the Japanese occupation period ended, and it was really it was interesting, and I'm glad he got to live to see the day, at least in terms of the country coming back to the hands of Koreans. And I think after that, my dad told me that he remembers my granddad being sort of a very almost famous figure in town. Like he was almost, because he was working as an interpreter for the government at the time, which was the US government was sort of the de facto kind of government, you know, at the time. So while Korea was trying to find its feet just after the end of the Japanese occupation. And so he worked for the government as an interpreter because he was one of the few people that ever spoke English. Studying abroad at the time that he grew up in was unheard of. So for him to go and having learned English, you know, he did that, and then he continued to teach English after he services in the government. And then unfortunately he passed away from illness at a very early age, at the age of 60. For me, it was quite a personal journey for me to go to visit because he is now buried in the Daejeon National Cemetery, which is one of two national cemeteries devoted to Korean veterans. And, he was fortunate enough to receive two military honors from presidential honors posthumously. And so he was buried there with a military ceremony. And my grandmother also was buried next to him with the military ceremony. And it was very, very interesting. I mean, the cemetery itself is like a tourist destination in that, there's a museum and kind of tracing the history, that part of history. And I think the most unusual part for me was, to see my name on a grave, was very interesting. But, because I am his granddaughter, my name was on the grave along with, my brother's name and all of our other, all of his other descendants. So, yeah, and I feel like, unfortunately, I never met my granddad before he passed away, but I think I've always found it to be so interesting, sort of the parallels between his life and my life, because he went off and studied abroad. I went off and studied abroad, having come from very humble beginnings. And I think, I've always felt like his maybe pioneering kind of spirit has always been with me. So.
One of the other things you had in that chapter were the 10 things you never knew about South Korea.
Among the sort of the 10 things, I think one of the most interesting things is the fact that the world's first social media network was launched in South Korea. And I think, technology is so, we'll go into that later, but technology is so advanced in Korea. And I think, I'm sure most people wouldn't have realized that South Korea did launch the first social media network, which was called Psy World. And, obviously it was very basic, at its core, it was more about just connecting people online in order for them to be connected offline. So it was more like, at its most basic form, it was just a list of contacts. And this was in the early 90s, 1991. So there was just a list of contacts, but then it kind of slightly evolved to have where you could have your avatar, you have your own avatar, and then you have your own virtual rooms, and then you decorate, and that kind of, it was almost similar to MySpace, which launched just a few years after Psy World. And so it was kind of interesting. And, also the world's first internet cafe was also launched in Korea.
The following chapter, you were talking about the Korean Peninsula. Would you like to talk about that a little bit? You mentioned the different cities.
Obviously, Seoul is the capital, which probably doesn't need an introduction. But I guess for me, Seoul, probably the most thing that I love about it the most is sort of the juxtaposition of the old and the new. If you visit the city, you can see there's so many vestiges of different, parts of its history. You'll see I love the palaces. There are 5 grand palaces that, which, are just incredible to look at. And I think, but then you'll see some of the most modern architecture in terms of I think the Lotte Tower is one of the most recent skyscrapers that were built, and it's the 5th largest, the 5th tallest building in the world. So I really enjoy that aspect of the old and the new coming together. And you can also get a taste of the real dynasty era in terms of the Joseon era. That there are these little villages. These villages are called Hanok villages, but they're sort of scattered around the country. But in Seoul, there's a few, and they're beautiful. And there are some images of that in the book. But they're beautiful because they have the very old architecture, which has heated ondolbang, which means it's this very heated floor, heated by kind of I don't know what it is. I guess it's charcoal or rocks, but it's heated from the outside, and it's a real quintessential aspect of how homes were designed back then in that era. So I really love that you can have access to all of that in Seoul. And I guess in moving on to the second city, Busan, for me, I think, I was a bit of a surprise for me with Busan, because I've always grown up seeing it as some real country kind of, countryside kind of area, but like, because my dad grew up not just far from there, and you know, people in Busan and different parts of South Korea have different accents as well, and people in Busan have a specific accent as well. And I think I never saw it as this modern city, but like it's definitely burgeoned so much. And I mean, some of the most expensive plots of land like are on just the coast in Busan, and some of the skyscrapers there outside of Seoul. I mean, obviously Seoul has the most expensive plots of land, but the outside of Seoul has the most expensive real estate, and probably I would say probably the most, maybe the best aspect is the fact that you get both the beach as well as the city in Busan. So you can see right along, I mean, some of the most popular beaches, two of the most popular beaches are in Busan as well, Kwangali Beach and Haeundae. And so, you know, you've got that kind of, you have that coastal break as well as, you know, the buzzy city vibe. So, and you know, and Busan was featured in the Black Panther film as well during a car chase scene. So like, you kind of see how far it's come in terms of becoming this burgeoning city. So yeah, and obviously in terms of unspoiled landscapes, I mean, you can't really beat Jeju Island, which is another destination I would highly recommend for sure if you're visiting South Korea. You know, it's basically considered like the Hawaii of the country because of obviously the volcanic landscape as well. But for me, probably one of the most interesting, I mean, the destination, yeah, the volcanic landscape, as well as the fact that it's a honeymoon destination, which I know Hawaii is as well, but it's definitely the honeymoon destination, the traditional quintessential honeymoon destination of Koreans. So you'll see lots of couples walking around with matching shirts and things like that, who you know, yeah, on their honeymoon. But I would say probably the other interesting historical aspect of the island is its clan of like female divers known as Haenyeo. And Haenyeos are, I mean, they've been around from like the 400 AD era. And I think the diving tradition goes that far back. But then the first record of them was in the 17th century. And by the 18th century, female divers had taken over the diving industry in Jeju Island. And I think, and it's been that way since. And it's really interesting that it's probably the only example of a matriarchal structure in South Korea, which is really, really interesting. And it's still, and Haenyeo is actually a UNESCO designated intangible like heritage. It's been UNESCO designated. So it's a very, you know, prized sort of aspect of culture in South Korea. And I think, and Jeju Island itself is so unspoiled, like, you know, everyone wants to preserve that.
And then you finished the chapter speaking about North Korea.
Yes. North Korea, obviously, is, you know, as we all know, is one of the world's most secretive nations. And you know, I try my best to, obviously I've actually not visited North Korea. I mean, you can't really visit in terms of individual trips. You can only go obviously through organizing through a specific tour company that you have to be there on as part of a tour group. So there are a lot of difficulties to overcome in terms of planning a trip there if you wanted to go. But I think it's difficult in organizing, but I think, you know, I definitely appreciate sort of the very complex relationship between the South and the North, in terms of, you know, both countries are, you know, they share the same language, but it could be more black and white in terms of different aspects of the culture. And I think, I mean, you know, there's instantly like a tension. I think even, you know, if you visit like the DMZ, the JSA area, specifically the Joint Security Area, specifically within the DMZ, it's very like historical yet very tense, you know, vibe. And I think that just kind of is a testament to what a complex history it has, having been one peninsula. And then in 1953, obviously after the Korean War, it split, and the country is technically still at war because the president, Syngman Rhee, who became the first president of South Korea, he actually didn't officially sign the armistice agreement. He kind of refused to. So obviously America kind of had to step in, but like, you know, it's kind of, I mean, and in North Korea itself, there are lots of, historical kind of treasures that obviously the South Koreans can't really see. Like, for example, there's over 10,000 tombs from the Goguryeo era, which was the earliest of kingdoms, which is like, Goguryeo was one of the first 3 kingdoms that began, like the ancient kingdoms. And the tombs from that era, 10,000 of them are in North Korea. So, and then that's the only evidence of that era that exists. So it's very precious, definitely. And in terms of relations, I think between the two countries, like things sort of improved during the presidency of Kim Dae-jung, who I touch on in another part of the chapter, but like he is sort of known as the Nelson Mandela of South Korea because of all the works that he'd done in terms of improving relations between the two. And there was even during his presidency, there was even a train between North and South that was built in 2002. And it was a freight train that went from just outside Seoul to near the North Korean capital, Pyongyang. And it kind of functioned for a while, but then unfortunately the tensions rose again. So it was shut down in 2008. So now it's just a disused station, which I visited. And it's very interesting. It's because it's quite eerie in the sense that it's no longer in use, but kind of a constant reminder, I guess, of the existing tension. So.
Okay, after that, you talked about the Korean spirit. You talked about family life, Korean style.
I would say in terms of the most important takeaway maybe from this chapter, in terms of what defines the Korean spirit, I think would be probably the importance of family. And I think that stems back to the country's background in Confucian beliefs and in Confucianism, sort of forming the basis of a lot of society at the time in terms of the government and societal structure, and especially filial piety, which is this devotion and unconditional devotion and duty towards family, which is one of the classic Confucius teachings. And I think that kind of dictated a lot of like how Koreans live their lives and how they related to each other. So I think that's probably maybe one of the most interesting and overarching kind of themes of that chapter.
I was impressed when you were talking about the importance of education. I didn't realize the discipline that would be necessary to be a student in Korea.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up kind of like watching that and hearing about that. And I think again, it sort of goes back to government structure and how it was laid out historically. Because back in the day, like the only way to get ahead in society was through studies. In terms of, back in the day, it was studies of the Confucian teachings, which was what gave you kind of nobility status as well. In order to be able to, you needed to pass an exam, a civil service exam, and to become a government figure, you needed to do all these teachings. And so I think that kind of was always rooted in the culture in terms of clinging to education as sort of your pathway to success and kind of rising above. And I think that kind of definitely translated through generations in South Korean culture. And it's interesting how nobility status in Korea was also quite like fragile in the sense that maybe it's slightly different from like European, maybe Western sort of aristocracy, where it might be inherited, like your noble status will be inherited. But in Korean society, you needed to like, your children wouldn't automatically get it. You would need to like produce another person who would pass the government exams, and like if you didn't within like a few generations, I think 3 or so generations, you would then your family would lose their nobility status. And I think that probably is what maybe motivated people to like really get ahead in education even back then. And for sure now, I think, like, you know, especially high school students, I mean, I think the pressure is on from high school level in terms of your third year of high school is so important. I mean, in Korea, because, you know, you have to study to get into, you know, these entrance exams, and you want to get into the best, you know, colleges and universities in South Korea. And which is why you see so many students go to these after school prep schools called hagwons, and they're open till like midnight sometimes. And I think it's kind of crazy because, you know, average school day would begin at probably like 8 a.m. or something, and then end at like maybe 4 p.m. and which is in itself a long day. And I think, and then students go on to study either at the library or at a hagwon. And I mean, it was so much so, I think, that the current president, Moon Jae-in, he's been trying to do a lot of education reform in terms of, you know, he put a curfew on some of these hagwons so that they would have to shut down at 10 p.m. for health reasons.
Okay. Okay.
Definitely. And I think, I mean, which was a good call, I think, because you need a balance, isn't it? And I think, and also he wanted to make sure that, you know, private tutoring and that industry of private tutoring is like through the roof. It's probably almost the biggest industry in South Korea in terms of maybe older. I think it has the biggest private tutoring industry in the world. And that's all down to wanting to have their child, you know, get ahead and be able to make it into school. And I think into the best university. And unfortunately, you know, that kind of touches on, you know, the people who are the wealthiest, you know, children of the wealthiest families end up being able to even afford these hagwons and then be able to be educated enough to go. And I think the current president has been trying to sort of break down that divide, where he wanted to try to make the exams not as rigorous as they are now, and also to kind of cut down admission fees as well, so that the students won't have to study as hard as they do now in terms of to get into the school they want, or a decent school. And I think but I mean, it's still a pretty big part of Korean society. I mean, you know, parents really literally pray for their children to make it into school. Like, you'll see them at the Buddhist temples, like, you know, the day that everyone's got their entrance exam. Like, it's a real family occasion almost. So
10 fascinating Koreans.
I think of that group of people, I try to give like a broad range as well, in terms of people in sports to like actors, you know, civil rights activists and things, to politicians and stuff. But I think for me, maybe one of the most interesting, I mean, even probably two of the most interesting people is the guy I mentioned before, who An Chang-ho was the father of the Korean independence movement. He was interesting in that, you know, he's done a lot of groundbreaking work in America as well. And, you know, he was the first Asian from the Far East to be, you know, inducted into the International Civil Rights Hall of Fame. And that was down to like him being such a strong activist for Korean human rights in America. And his children as well, and themselves kind of went on to become pioneers of their own, because his daughter was the first Asian woman to be in the US Navy. And then his son, Philip An, was the first Korean actor to get a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. So I think it was almost like that family was sort of destined to do great things. And then the second people I mentioned in that list is the South Korean actress Chae Eun-hee and her director husband Shin Sang-ok. And their story is really like a film. I mean, you know, their life story is almost better than fiction, because they were one of the most famous people that had been abducted in North Korea. And it was kind of a thing that happened on and off in terms of South Koreans being, like, famous South Koreans being abducted. And in this case, they wanted the then leader at the time, the North Korean leader, he wanted to kind of develop the film industry. under the guise of wanting to develop the film industry, he kidnapped this really famous Korean actress at the time, Cheoni, and when she was abducted, it was such a, obviously make news headlines because there was no way to get her back. But her husband, who is also a famous film director, he infiltrated the country and under the guise of saying he wanted to develop North Korean film industry. And so he did that essentially just to find a way to save and rescue his wife. And so he went into the country, and I think they made this, after like a decade, they managed to escape the country. So it's a real interesting and unbelievable story. And their story actually has been featured in a documentary on Netflix back in 2016 called The Lovers and Despo, which is really interesting. So I think, for me, I think that they're really two of the most fascinating people.
You went and talked about relationships and social life.
I mean, stemming from the fact that family is at the core of Korean culture, I think family dynamics definitely is a tricky line to walk, and definitely because it's rooted in, maybe it's similar to lots of Asian cultures, but it's rooted in lots of expectations and duties, and not necessarily in a rigid sense, but it's all, I would say, based on Jung, which is this Korean word for this deep sense of connection and feelings of closeness for one another. And I think I find that it's hard to find an equivalent of that word in English, but it's basically this real deep bond that you have. And I think, that kind of plays into the inner workings of family dynamics for sure, because it's all rooted in Jung. It's all motivated by Jung. So I think that's probably the most interesting aspect in terms of relationships and social life in Korea.
We have a lot of viewers that will like your next chapter, the At the Table chapter.
I absolutely love Korean food. I don't know if you tried Korean food, Paul, but
quite a bit. We have.
Yeah, it's definitely my favorite. So I think really it was really fun for me to talk about some of the nuances of Korean dining and etiquette and things, which are practiced by Koreans for sure. I mean, it's not in such a strict sense, but again, I think it's amazing how even Korean dining and eating, all of that is centered around the importance of family and the importance of respect for elders and people older than you. And I think that was probably the most interesting aspect for me to sort of present in that chapter.
You listed 5 unusual Korean delicacies. Have you tried all 5 of those?
I haven't tried all 5, but I have tried 2 of them. And I would say, if for those who are sort of scared of the 2 that I've tried, I do enjoy, actually, because they're not too bad. First one is sort of the Korean style blood sausage, which is called sundae. And sundae is actually, I mean, I'd never tried a blood sausage in other cultures, but it's interesting because it's mostly, I mean, it's savory and it looks like black pudding almost, it's black, but it's filled with glass noodles as well. And I think it's just made from the pig intestines, but it's actually it's tasty, I would say, more than it sounds. And also the other food from that list I would recommend is mook, which is it has this jelly-like substance, but it's made of acorn. It's kind of this jelly version of acorn. And I think that also, it's something about it. It's I quite enjoy it. I mean, I know, despite the unusual texture, I think it's really something is very Moorish about it. So definitely I would recommend those 2. But the others, the nakji, which is the pie, it's very difficult to try, in terms of you would need to have a strong stomach.
Well, then you have a chapter on K culture, which you started talking about K-pop.
I think I wanted to begin that chapter with K-pop because I think probably like, the K-pop that I grew up with in the 90s, it's so different from what the K-pop that has evolved to what it has become now, the global phenomenon that it's become. And I think I'm very proud and really impressed by how much it's evolved and advanced, and how sort of dynamic K-pop artists have become. And I think I really think K-pop music in the past probably decade or so has really served as an ambassador for Korean culture. So it felt right to start the chapter with K-pop. And I mean, I would say I almost like I owe this book to K-pop in terms of like the interest in K-pop that sort of motivated this book, you know. So it only felt right to acknowledge that. And I think the start of like K-pop, I think the real kind of, I think, resurgence and interest in K-pop, I think, began probably back in like 2012 to this artist called Psy. He released this music video and song called Gangnam Style. And at the time, it became the first ever YouTube video to hit a billion views. And it was only like 6 months after it was released. So like, it's, you know, that was kind of the start of many sort of accolades that that song started to achieve. But like, I mean, and then when I watched the video, I remember kind of cringing, thinking like, this is really embarrassing. I can't believe they're doing this. But then I was so amazed by how the world embraced that music and that song. And I think it kind of stemmed, I mean, you know, he has almost become a veteran of the industry now. He went on to like launch his own label, and, you know, he's kind of in the back and behind the scenes now. But you know, going back to more like modern artists now, like, you know, you can't deny sort of the popularity of BTS. Obviously, they've done some groundbreaking work for sure, and of course I mentioned them in my book. And you know, they've just last year they were the first artists to perform at the Grammys, which is like, you know, the biggest kind of thing you could ever achieve probably as a musician. So I think that in itself kind of was quite a symbol of how far it's come, for sure. Along with K-pop, I probably owe this book to Korean cinema as well, because, you know, it really took off last year and 2019. In terms of 2019, actually marked 100 years of Korean cinema. So, you know, 2019 also genuinely became a golden year, I think, for Korean filmmaking, because with the success of the film Parasite by Bong Joon-ho, who we all now know, but like, you know, he won, you know, that film won 4 of the 6 categories that it was nominated for an Oscar, which is like unheard of. I mean, for the film to even have been nominated, I think genuinely was, you know, an amazing achievement. And then for it to then have this sweeping kind of win was just remarkable at the time. And you know, he won for Best Picture as well. So I think that kind of really opened up and ignited probably a renewed interest in Korean films. I mean, people probably know about other things. I mean, he's done other blockbuster films as well, with different sort of Hollywood actors, which didn't take off as much as Parasite. But like, you know, people know about other films like Old Boy as well, which is another film I think that non-Koreans would know about. But I think certainly after the sweeping win that it had, not just at the Oscars, but also at the BAFTAs as well, and the Golden Globes, I think Korean artists and just that whole industry, Korean TV, obviously with Sandra Oh as well, winning so many awards at the Golden Globes. And I think that definitely, it's definitely Korean cinema and Korean TV, and, you know, Korean actors are definitely having their moment for sure. In terms of art and design, I think like contemporary art and design, there are 2 museums probably in Seoul that I would recommend. I mean, there's over 100 galleries in Seoul itself, but the National Museum of Modern Art, Modern and Contemporary Art Korea, as well as the Liam Samson Museum of Art, I think are 2 probably staples that anyone who has any interest in art should be visiting. And I think in terms of like artwork, that's quite, I mean, both of those museums showcase contemporary art, but the Liam Sangsum Museum also showcases a bit of traditional art as well. So if you wanted to hit both, you would probably see that museum. But in terms of like really traditional, unique Korean art, in the late 70s, there was a group of painters who launched this form of painting called tansekwa. And it's this form of Korean monochromatic painting. And I think it kind of had a resurgence in 2015 after this octogenarian like Korean artist, tansekwa artist, was featured at his work was entered into the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I think after that, there was like a renewed interest. And I mean, if you look at the style of tansekwa paintings, like it's quite subtle and like minimalist and abstract. But I think I feel like when I look at it, it feels kind of like quite ahead of its time. The fact that it was in the 70s, it doesn't feel like something from the 70s. It feels like something that's really relevant now. So yeah, I think definitely I would recommend checking out that kind of artwork when you're in South Korea. And obviously elsewhere in South Korea, there's the Gwangju Biennale in Gwangju in the southern province, the Jeollanam-do province. And it's Asia's oldest biennale of contemporary art. And obviously it's set in a city that is obviously has a history of the Gwangju uprisings in May 1980. And that's, it's a tragic history of like, which saw the deaths of lots of civilians at the time that were just going against, rising against the military sort of government structure at the time. But obviously the Gwangju Biennale was sort of launched as a symbolic sort of time of a way of kind of healing the country, that part of history for the natives through art. And so yeah, it's just been going strong.
My personal favorite in that chapter was your discussion on technology.
Technology, I mean, it's everywhere. Like when you visit South Korea, it's so, it's really evident in terms of like when you're just going on the metro, like you see like grandmothers with like high-tech smartphones like navigating their way through, and it's so amazing to see that. And I think, as of 2017, I think around like almost 100% of the country's population uses the internet. So its greatest strengths has always been advanced technology, and especially mobile technology. It was the first to offer nationwide 5G in the world. And, it's just, I think in that sense, like the country, I mean, it's almost like the chicken or the egg. I don't know. Is it because of the demand, like people are just so wanting to be switched on that it's become so advanced? Or is it like because the country's so advanced in technology that everyone has to be switched on and like, accessing it? But whatever the origins of it, I think, South Korea's technology is definitely really advanced, ahead of even like definitely ahead of other Asian countries in terms of, phones, especially phones actually, because family that I have in South Korea, they always tell me like people just switch phones as if they're switching socks. So it's like, it's quite like, that's just kind of an example of how much people appreciate technology.
You mentioned that the robots that were at the airport helping people with their tickets and how to find help.
Yeah. LG launched these robot helpers, and I think maybe they were the first to ever do that. But like, basically they were designed to, the robot speaks a few languages, and I think they were set up to speak 5 common most languages found like at the airport. And it's really interesting because you can just kind of tell it to, if you need to find your flight or your gate or whatever, it helps you. And it also automatically detects like what parts of the airport need to be cleaned, like, and it just kind of goes off in its own direction. Yeah.
A chapter about K-beauty.
Yeah, the chapter on beauty, I think like it's really interesting in terms of, one of the most interesting parts of that chapter is just the basic kind of, I think, perception of Korean beauty, which people might not realize. It's probably slightly overarching into other Asian countries, but I opened that chapter with an anecdote about what happened to me when I was visiting South Korea after not having seen my mother's side is all in South Korea, and I hadn't seen my uncle in like years, probably since I was a child, and I was visiting South Korea at the time. And I just walked in, I met him at the hotel, and he just said to me, literally his words were not even hello or how are you? It was just, what's happened to your skin? It's not like porcelain white as it used to be as a child. And I think it kind of showed an example of how, like, you know, kind of tan skin isn't considered the kind of, and the mark of beauty. And that also goes back to history, because in historical times, people from wealthy families were not outside, like the nobility, the upper elite aristocracy, they were not outside. So naturally their skin would be just very pale. But people who were, the workers and the farmers, they were the ones who were outside. So it kind of was a reflection of your social status. So I think in some ways that stems into the modern history, a modern landscape. But at the same time, I think, preserving the skin, in terms of skincare and sun cream and things like that, I think that probably adds to the fact that, like, that's why Koreans have maintained their beauty, because of how much they treasure like their skin and things. So tying in with like sort of the importance that of skincare and just beauty, like holding it to great esteem. I think South Korea is among the top 5 countries in the world with the most plastic surgeons, and it actually has the highest per capita rate of plastic surgery in the world. I think nearly almost 1 million surgeries are done in a year. And I mean, it is a real remarkable statistic for sure. But I think, it's even more remarkable how normalized it is in terms of in the country. You'll see lots of, ads for plastic surgery, like just, on the metro or something. Like it wouldn't be something that you would be necessarily embarrassed about to have it done. It would, it might be slightly more looked down upon, or, even in American society, but like it wouldn't be something that would, surprise anyone if you had it done. And probably the most common surgery is the double eyelid surgery, which is to give you that double, essentially to make your eyes look bigger. So a lot of women and men have the surgery where you've got sort of larger eyes rather than, it kind of expands your eyes. So, and which they see as kind of almost reflective of like maybe Western eyes. So it sort of stems from that. But I think it's interesting how, I mean, some of the doctors are in Seoul as well. Specifically within the Gangnam district, which is this luxury neighborhood in Seoul. There is actually a place that, like, an area called the Beauty Belt, where like the top clinics are. So yeah, anyone who's interested in surgery can go to the Gangnam district's Beauty Belt if you are interested.
You also talked about health and wellness and life expectancy.
So, and I think it ties in with kind of the general kind of importance of health and value that's paid, and just the general diet. I think going back to Korean traditional foods. I mean, speaking of really traditional Korean foods, I mean, kimchi, which is like a staple in the Korean diet, which is this fermented cabbage dish. Kimchi in itself alone has so many it's become this health food. And now you see it in menus at restaurants, Western restaurants everywhere. There's an infusion of some sort of kimchi in there. And I think, but at its heart, I mean, the benefits of kimchi have been, well known in terms of antioxidants, cancer fighting kind of qualities and vitamins that it provides. And I think having that be kind of a basic part of the diet, I think probably definitely contributes to the fact that it's probably helped to extend the life expectancy of the country for sure. And I think by 2030, it's projected that South Korean women are going to be the first whose life expectancy is going to be between 86 and 87, or over it actually. And there's a 90% chance of that. That's being projected that will happen by 2030. And then there's, which will make them the first country in the world to have a life expectancy beyond that, beyond the 86, 87 mark. So, you know, I mean, again, the fact that it's women, maybe it is down to the fact that women look after themselves so much in South Korea, you know, in terms of the beauty industry, not just skincare, but just all around healthcare. I think definitely women probably are at the forefront of that for sure.
And then I think it said in that chapter that the healthcare is free in South Korea for the people living there.
Yes, I mean, it's funded by a national health insurance scheme. So obviously the monthly contribution is paid by your employer. Mm-hmm. But you wouldn't be paying any extra costs, obviously. Okay. I mean, there is also a self-employed scheme as well in terms of if you don't have an employer. But, and also foreign nationals who have lived there for 6 months. As of actually 2019, foreign nationals who live there for 6 months or more are required to sign up for the national health insurance scheme. So, and I think, again, it kind of just comes down to the fact that the country itself really values health. And it probably ties into why their life expectancy has expanded so much, because they really prioritize health. And, you know, even private healthcare costs are actually, even though, I mean, down because of its like technology, like it has some of the best medical facilities in the world. And, you know, at a fraction of the price that you might get in the US or Europe, it's almost like 20-30% of what they would cost for some procedures. So, you know, medical tourism definitely is a thing in Korea in terms of like people coming to get certain treatments, just because of it's more cost efficient for sure.
I want to ask you to share with us any advice you would have for new writers.
If you're starting out, I think as like, you know, just fresh out of university, I think getting into the industry in terms of the writing industry in general, for me, one of my first foots in the door was just by cold calling a company. Like I used to work for this TV program called The Charlie Rose Show in America, and yeah, which is on PBS. And that I just got by actually just phoning them up. I mean, they didn't advertise anything, but I'd phoned them and I asked them if they were doing any sort of internships. And, you know, I was lucky enough, the producer said to me, actually, we are. And so I went in and then I interviewed, and then that was it. Like that was sort of my first connection. And I think, so, you know, don't be afraid to kind of just phone companies up that you're interested in terms of like different publications. Because I think it's really important to really, you know, write for different publications if you really want to start gaining experience. And then in terms of like writing a book and wanting to like get into that, I think for me what's helped was having like a subject of expertise. For me, it's become Korea, and I think maybe it sort of happened accidentally just from my career as a journalist. I was covering Korea, so like it helped me stand out, I suppose. My publishers came to me, and I was one of the lucky few when my publishers found me, you know. So, and I think that's down to the fact that I had a subject that a subject of expertise, and I think that might be something that you might look into. I think if you wanted to sort of build your way up to something, like if you have a book idea in mind, I would say like try to sort of build your expertise around it, and then it will be almost like, you know, publishers might come find you once they know that you are the expert in that subject. So I hope the book will inspire people to visit Korea as well, but just to kind of, you know, explore more things, because obviously my book provides an overview, but I hope that it will just motivate people to want to delve deeper into the culture for sure. Thank you so much for the chance to talk about my book.